Chapter 27, Kidnapped. When Daisy arrived home from school that afternoon, playing with her bandolore as she went, she headed as usual to her father's workshop to tell him about her day. However, to her surprise, she found the workshop locked up. Assuming that Mr. Dovetail had finished work early and was back in the cottage, she walked in through the front door with her school books under her arm. Daisy stopped dead in the doorway, staring around. All the furniture was gone, as were the pictures on the walls, the rug on the floor, the lamps, and even the stove. She opened her mouth to call her father, but in that instant, a sack was thrown over her head and a hand clamped over her mouth. Her school books and her bandolore fell with a series of thuds to the floor. Daisy was lifted off her feet, struggling wildly, then carried out of the house and slung into the back of a wagon. "If you make a noise," said a rough voice in her ear, "we'll kill your father." Daisy, who drawn breath into her lungs to scream, let it out quietly instead. She felt the wagon lurch and heard the jingling of a harness and trotting hooves as they began to move. By the turn that the wagon took, Daisy knew that they were heading out of the city within the city, and by the sounds of the market traders and other horses, she realized they were moving into a wider Showville. Though more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, Daisy nevertheless forced herself to concentrate on every turn, every sound, and every smell, so she could get some idea of where she was being taken. Smart kid. After a while, the horses' hooves were no longer falling on cobblestones, but on an earthly track, and the sugar-sweet smell of Showville was gone, replaced by the green, loamy smell of the countryside. The man who'd kidnapped Daisy was a large, rough member of the Ickabog Defense Brigade called Private Prod. Spittleworth had told Prod to get rid of the little Dovetail girl, and Prod had understood Spittleworth to mean that he was to kill her. Let's hope not. Prod was quite right to think this. Spittleworth had selected Prod for the job of murdering Daisy because Prod was fond of using his fists and seemed not to care whom he hurt. However, as he drove through the countryside, passing woods and forests where he might easily strangle Daisy and bury her body, it slowly dawned on Private Prod that he wasn't going to be able to do it. He happened to have a little niece around Daisy's age, of whom he was very fond. In fact, every time he imagined himself strangling Daisy, he seemed to see his niece Rosie in his mind's eye, pleading for her life. So instead of turning off the dirt track into the woods, Prod drove the wagon onward, racking his brains as to what to do with Daisy. Inside the flour sack, Daisy smelled the sausages of Barronstown, mingling with the cheese fumes of Kurtzburg, and wondered which of the two she'd been taken to. Her father had occasionally taken her to buy cheese and meat in these famous cities. She believed that if she could somehow give the driver the slip when he lifted her down from the wagon, she'd be able to make her way back to Showville in a couple of days. Her frantic mind kept returning to her father, and there he was, and why all the furniture in the house had been removed, and why she'd been forced to concentrate on the journey the wagon was making instead, to be sure of finding her way home again. However, hard as she listened for the sound of the horses' hooves on the stone bridge over the Fluma that connected Barronstown and Kurtzburg, it never came, because instead of entering either city, Private Prod passed them by. He just had a brainwave about what to do with Daisy. So, skirting the city of sausage makers, he drove on north. Slowly, the meat and cheese smells disappeared from the air, and night began to fall. Private Prod had remembered an old woman who lived on the outskirts of Jeroboam, which happened to be his hometown. Everyone called this old woman Ma Grunter. She took in orphans and was paid 1 ducat. I looked it up, guys, during class today. in the in-person class in the morning. It's pronounced ducket. So sorry for saying ducat 100 times. It's ducket. Now, let's find my place. She took an order and paid 1 ducat a month for each child she had living with her. No boy or girl had ever succeeded in running away from Ma Grunter's house, and it was this that made Prod decide to take Daisy there. The last thing he wanted was Daisy finding her way back home to Showville, because Spittleworth was likely to be furious that Prod hadn't done what he was told. Though so scared, cold, and uncomfortable in the back of the wagon, and the rocking had lulled Daisy to sleep, but suddenly she jerked awake again and could smell something different on the air now, something she did not much like. And after a while, she identified it as wine fumes, which she recognized from the rare occasions when Mr. Dovetail had a drink. They must be approaching Jeroboam, a city she had never visited. Through the small holes in the sack, she could see daybreak. The wagon was soon jolting over cobblestones again, and after a while, it came to a halt. At once, Daisy tried to wriggle out of the back of the wagon onto the ground, but before she had hit the street, Private Prod seized her. Then he carried her, struggling, to the door of Ma Grunter's, which he pounded with a heavy fist. All right, I'm coming," came a high, cracked voice from inside the house. There came the noise of many bolts and chains being removed, and Ma Grunter was revealed in the doorway, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane, though, of course, Daisy, being still in the sack, couldn't see her. "New child for you, Ma," said Prod, carrying the wriggling sack into Ma Grunter's hallway, which smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap wine. Now, you might think Ma Grunter would be alarmed to see a child in a sack carried into her house, but in fact, the kidnapped children of so-called traitors had found their way to her before. She didn't care what a child's story was. All she cared about was the 1 ducat a month the authorities paid her for keeping them. The more children she packed into her tumble-down hovel, the more wine she could afford, which was really all she cared about. So she held out her hand and croaked. Sounds like Miss Finnegan from Annie. 5 ducat placement fee, which was what she always asked for, if she could tell somebody really wanted to get rid of a child. Prod scowled, handed over 5 ducats, and left without another word. Ma Grunter slammed the door behind her. As he climbed back into his wagon, Prod heard the rattle of Ma Grunter's chains and scraping of her locks. Even if it had cost him half his month's pay, Prod was glad to have gotten rid of the problem of Daisy Dovetail as he drove off as fast as he could back to the capital. Chapter 28. Ma Grunter. Having made sure her front door was secure, Ma Grunter pulled the sack off her new charge. Blinking in the sudden light, Daisy found herself in a narrow, rather dirty hallway, face to face with a very ugly old woman who was dressed all in black, a large brown wart with hairs growing out of it on the tip of her nose. "John," the old woman croaked without taking her eyes off of Daisy, and a much bigger and older than boy with... Try that again. And a boy much bigger and older than Daisy with a blunt, scowling face came shuffling into the hall, cracking his knuckles. "Go and tell the Janes upstairs to put another mattress in their room." "Make one of the little brats do it," grunted John. "I haven't had breakfast." Ma Grunter suddenly swung her heavy silver-handled cane at the boy's head. Daisy expected to hear a horrible thud of silver on bone, but the boy ducked the cane neatly, as though he'd had a lot of practice, cracked his knuckles again, and said sullenly, All right. He disappeared up some rickety stairs. "What's your name?" said Ma Grunter, turning back to Daisy. "Daisy," said Daisy. "No, it isn't," said Ma Grunter. "Your name is Jane." Daisy would soon find out that Ma Grunter did the same thing to every single child who arrived in her house. Every girl was rechristened Jane, and every boy was renamed John. The way the child reacted to being given a new name told Ma Grunter exactly what she needed to know about how hard it was going to be to break that child's spirit. Of course, the very tiny children who came to Ma Grunter simply agreed that their name was John or Jane and quickly forgot that they'd been called anything else. Homeless children and lost children who could tell that being John or Jane was the price of having a roof over their heads were also quick to agree to the change. But every so often, Ma Grunter met a child who wouldn't accept their new name without a fight. And she knew before Daisy even opened her mouth that the girl was going to be one of them. There was a nasty, proud look about the newcomer, and while skinny, she looked strong, standing there in her coveralls with her fists clenched. "My name," said Daisy, "is Daisy Dovetail. I was named after my mother's favorite flower." "Your mother is dead," said Ma Grunter, because she always told the children in her care that their parents were dead. It was best if the little wretches didn't think there was anybody to run away to. "That is true," said Daisy, her heart hammering very fast. "My mother is dead." "And so is your father," said Ma Grunter. The horrible woman seemed to swim before Daisy's eyes. She'd had nothing to eat since the previous lunchtime and had spent a night of terror on Prod's wagon. Nevertheless, she said in a cold, clear voice, "My father's alive. I'm Daisy Dovetail, and my father lives in Showville." She had to believe her father was still there. She couldn't let herself doubt it, because if her father was dead, then all light would disappear from the world forever. "No, he isn't," said Ma Grunter, raising her cane. "Your father's as dead as a doornail, and your name is Jane." "My name," began Daisy, but with a sudden whoosh, Ma Grunter's cane came swinging at her head. Daisy ducked as she'd seen the big boy do, but the cane swung back again, and this time it hit Daisy painfully on the ear and knocked her sideways. "Let's try that again," said Ma Grunter. "Repeat after me. My father is dead, and my name is Jane." "I won't," shouted Daisy, and before the cane could swing back at her, she darted under Ma Grunter's arm and run off into the house, hoping that the back door might not have bolts on it. In the kitchen, she found two skinny, frightened-looking children, a boy and a girl, ladling a dirty green liquid into bowls, and a door with just as many chains and padlocks on it as the other. Daisy turned and ran back to the hall, dodged Ma Grunter and her cane, then sped upstairs, where more thin, pale children were cleaning and making beds with threadbare sheets. Ma Grunter was already climbing the stairs behind her. "Say it," croaked Ma Grunter. "Say, my father is dead and my name is Jane." "My father's alive and my name is Daisy," shouted Daisy, now spotting a hatch in the ceiling that she suspected led to an attic. Snatching a feather duster out of the hand of a scared girl, she poked the hatch open. A rope ladder fell, which Daisy climbed, pulling it up after her and slamming the attic door so that Ma Grunter and her cane couldn't reach her. She could hear the old woman cackling below and ordering a boy to stand guard over the hatch to make sure Daisy did not come out. Later, Daisy would discover that the children gave one another extra names so they knew which John or Jane they were talking about. The big boy, standing guard over the attic hatch, was the same one Daisy had seen downstairs. His nickname among the other children was Basher John, for the way he bullied the smaller children. Basher John was by way of being a deputy for Ma Grunter, and now he called up to Daisy, telling her children had died of starvation in that attic and that she'd find their skeletons if she looked hard enough. The ceiling of Ma Grunter's attic was so low that Daisy had to crouch. It was also very dirty, but there was a small hole in the roof, through which a shaft of sunlight fell. Daisy wriggled over to this and put her eye to it. Now she could see the skyline of Jeroboam. Unlike Showville, where the buildings were mostly sugar white, this was a city of dark gray stone. Two men were reeling along the street below, bellowing a popular drinking song. I drank a single bottle, and the Ickabog's a lie. I drank another bottle, and I thought I heard it sigh. And now I've drunk another. I can see it slinking by. The Ickabog is coming, so let's drink before we die. It's a great song. Daisy sat with her eye pressed against the spy hole for an hour until Ma Grunter came and banged on the hatch with her cane. What is your name? Daisy Dovetail, bellowed Daisy. And every hour afterward, the question came and the answer remained the same. However, as the hours wore by, Daisy began to feel lightheaded with hunger. Every time she shouted Daisy Dovetail, back at Ma Grunter, her voice was weaker. At last, she saw through her spy hole in the attic that it was becoming dark. She was very thirsty now, and she had to face the fact that if she kept refusing to say her name was Jane, there really might be a skeleton in the attic for Basher John to frighten other children with. So the next time Ma Grunter banged on the attic hatch with her cane and asked what Daisy's name was, she answered, Jane. And is your father alive? Asked Ma Grunter. Daisy crossed her fingers and said, no. Very good, said Ma Grunter, pulling open the hatch so that the rope ladder fell down. Come down here, Jane. When Daisy was standing beside her again, the old lady cuffed her around the ear. That's for being a nasty, lying, filthy little brat. Now go and drink your soup, wash up the bowl, then go to bed. Daisy gulped down a small bowl of cabbage soup, which was the nastiest thing she'd ever eaten, washed the bowl in the greasy barrel that Ma Grunter kept for doing dishes, then went back upstairs. There was a spare mattress on the floor of the girl's bedroom, so she crept inside while all the other girls watched her, and got under the threadbare blanket, fully dressed because the room was very cold. Daisy found herself looking into the kind blue eyes of a girl her own age with a gaunt face. You lasted much longer than most, whispered the girl. She had an accent Daisy had never heard before. Later, Daisy would learn that the girl was a Marshlander. What's your name? Daisy whispered. Your real name. The girl considered Daisy with those huge forget-me-not eyes. We're not allowed to say. I promise I won't tell, whispered Daisy. The girl stared at her. Just when Daisy thought she wasn't going to answer, the girl whispered, Martha. Pleased to meet you, Martha, whispered Daisy. I'm Daisy Dovetail, and my father is still alive. All right. Tomorrow, you'll get chapter 29, Mrs. Beamish Worries. Until then.